All right, so we're diving into some pretty murky waters today. This whole thing about Canada wanting to put a cap on how much oil and gas emissions the country can produce.
Yeah, it's a big one. Definitely causing a lot of waves.
Absolutely. Our listeners have been sending in tons of info on this, the government's plans,
Hmm.
what everyone's saying about it, and, well, it's complicated, right?
It is.
So we're going to try to break it down, make it
Yeah.
make sense.
Cut through the noise.
Give everyone listening the need-to-know info on this major policy debate that's going on.
So where do we start?
Well, the feds actually promised this cap way back in 2021.
Hmm. Yeah, and then the actual draft regulations, like the nitty-gritty details, came out last November.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Like, how much do they actually want to cut?
The big goal is to slash emissions by about a third within 8 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it is a lot. By the early 2030s, they want to be 35% below what emissions were back in 2019.
Okay, so a third less pollution coming from oil and gas by 2030. That's the target.
Right. And it's important to highlight they keep saying this is a cap on emissions, not production.
Meaning?
They're pushing for cleaner technology investments, not necessarily shutting down oil and gas operations altogether, but making them cleaner.
So how do they actually plan to make that happen?
They're going with a cap and trade system.
Right. I've heard that thrown around, but to be honest, I'm not totally clear on how it works.
So basically, companies get allowances for how much they can emit.
Like permission slips for pollution.
Kind of, yeah. If they manage to pollute less than their allowance, they can sell those extra allowances to other companies who maybe are having trouble staying under their limit.
Huh. So it's like a financial incentive to clean up your act.
Exactly. The environment minister, what's his name?
Terry Digwood.
Right, Dugwood, he had this great line about it. He said, "We want that energy. What we don't want is that pollution."
Catchy.
Yeah. And just to be clear, this whole thing is separate from the carbon price that consumers pay, at the pump and stuff.
Right. Which is another whole debate, especially with the election coming up.
Exactly.
Okay, so the government's all gung-ho about this cap and trade thing, saying it's the way to cut emissions without hurting the oil and gas industry. But not everyone's buying it right.
Definitely not. You've got industry leaders and pretty much the entire Conservative Party saying, no way this is going to work.
Yeah. Poilievre has said straight up, if he's elected, he's scrapping this whole thing.
Right. And, Danielle Smith, the Alberta premier, she has not been holding back.
Oh, she's been furious, calling the targets completely unrealistic and even threatening to take the feds to court over this.
Yeah, she's not mincing words. And it's not just politicians. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, that's the big industry group, they're saying this is going to scare away investors and kill jobs.
And some energy execs have even gone so far as to say we're in an energy crisis and this whole cap needs to be thrown out the window.
It's a pretty stark divide.
Yeah. So how do we make sense of this? Who's right? Is this even feasible?
Well, let's look at some numbers for a second. Back in 2022, oil and gas production accounted for almost a third of Canada's total emissions.
A third. Wow.
Yeah, it's a big chunk. But here's an interesting tidbit. Between 2019 and 2022, emissions from that sector actually went down by 4%.
Even though we were producing about the same amount of oil and gas.
Exactly. So that shows that some reduction is possible even without drastic measures.
So maybe there's hope.
Maybe, and the government is really banking on methane reductions. They think about half of the cuts they need to make can come from just plugging methane leaks.
Which is already something companies are working on.
Because there are incentives and regulations already in place for that.
Okay, so we've got this real tension here. Government's all optimistic, saying they can cut pollution without touching production using this cap and trade scheme.
Right, but then you have industry and certain politicians basically saying, nope, this is going to force us to cut production and wreck the economy. It's a tough one. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, the feds want to cap emissions from oil and gas, aiming for a huge reduction by the early 2030s. They're going with this cap and trade system, and they're adamant that this won't mess with production levels.
Right. And then on the other side, you've got industry and some politicians saying this is all wishful thinking. They think production cuts are inevitable, and that's going to have a ripple effect on the economy.
And then we've got the fact that some emissions reductions have happened already, so maybe it's not impossible.
Right. But that brings us to the bigger picture. Like, what does all this mean for everyday Canadians? That's what we really need to think about.
Exactly. It boils down to this. How do we balance our environmental goals with the reality that oil and gas is a huge part of our economy?
Exactly. The government's betting that this cap will actually drive innovation. Companies will be forced to come up with cleaner ways of doing things.
But then the industry is worried that The cap itself will scare away investment and make it harder to innovate because the risk is just too high. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
So we've laid out the facts, the different perspectives, the potential upsides and downsides. But for everyone listening out there, here's something to chew on.
Given everything we've talked about, the progress that's been made on cutting emissions already, but also how much pushback there is on this plan.
What do you think are the most likely unintended consequences of this policy? I mean, regardless of what the government says they're trying to do, what are the things that might happen that nobody's really expecting?
It's complex, right? Because even with the best intentions, the actual impact of something like this can be totally different from what was planned.
Definitely something to think about.
Absolutely.
Thanks for breaking this down with me today.
Anytime.